relevant with us honoring veterans is the story of 30 men of valor that served King David. What was always intriguing to me is that David one day was thinking out loud, and he said, if only I could have some fresh water from the wells of Bethlehem. Now, there were wells around where he was, but he wanted fresh water from the wells of Bethlehem. 3 men of valor said, we're going to go into enemy territory and we're going to get our king his fresh water. And they did. And they did. Behind me is a flag that I brought with me. It was a flag flown over Iraq. And was presented to me. And so I thought that it was only right that I could bring it and share with you all at least a visual. It's always wonderful to see the American flag. When you think about it, when we look at the flag of the United States of America, we all experience things differently. Now, the flag is symbolic, but because of the oath you and I take, it cements the relationship that we have with our great nation. I don't know about you, but when I see someone burning the American flag, there's something in me that just rises up and wants to do something about it. Of course, we can't. Flag burning is a horrible thing to see. But today what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you about the unsung hero. And I've had the opportunity, thanks to John, to share with veterans groups and first responders now for a number of times here at First Pres. But I want to talk to you about the unsung hero. A little bit different. And there is an unsung hero of our military veteran, unheard of by our social society because they're silent. There's a quietness about them. There is quiet stress within them. And that person is a veteran of a different calling. That veteran is called the spouse. The spouse. Today is a little bit different because we know that men and women serve as veterans, and incredibly different is that now women serve in actual combat. And that's always amazing to me. But I'm reminding myself, if my male chauvinism starts rising up, of a young man that I met in Jericho, and he was an Israeli soldier, and his nose was all bent up and bandaged. And I said, what under God's heaven happened to you? And he looked at me and he said, never say something nice to our female soldiers. And I'm going to tell you, I've seen some of those Israeli female soldiers, and you don't want to say something nice to them. You just keep your distance and away. But think about, much like the law enforcement mate who sees their loved one in uniform with a badge and a gun on their side, and they go out the door, think about what goes on through the mind. They don't know if that person whom they love is coming home. I married the only non-cop in the Miller household. And there is a lot of years of law enforcement in the Millers, but I was the smart one. I married the non-cop, but she's more of a cop than they ever were. My father-in-law was a canine cop, and then later the head homicide detective in Martin County Sheriff's Department. But I'm going to tell you something about him. He was first and foremost a man of God, a man of family, and then law enforcement was his third choice. But let's talk about a little bit about these unsung heroes who have to live with the fact that when their son or daughter goes off to war, they're not sure that they're coming back. When our son Nathan was in the 1st Marine Group in Operation Iraqi Freedom, I want you to know that as parents, we knew about the stress and the struggle. It seemed like we were forever in front of the television watching the news about what was happening in Iraq, looking at every ship that was going in and unloading troops and waiting for the day that our boy would come back. Now, I've officiated over a lot of military funerals of every branch, including the Merchant Marines, John, because I know that's so dear to John. And they serve with great dignity. One of the things that I've learned, though, is that oftentimes in the generations, especially when it gets to the grandchildren, that they somehow don't realize just how much of a hero their grandfather or grandmother was. I think of my Uncle Tony, who served in Europe in the Marine Corps, and he was shot by Nazi machine gun fire and was in a ditch for over a week while Nazi soldiers were marching by until he was finally rescued by our American troops. I could tell you many stories. I think of Sergeant Kip Jacoby, who was in that 16 SEAL team that was over Afghanistan. Lone Survivor was a movie made, and you'll see Kip at the end of that. And I can still see his mother up on the roof of their house removing tile from the area where Kip's bedroom was. I still know of her when she would be homeless. Now, she didn't have to be homeless, but she had lost everything in her heart and mind, and she would be with a basket walking along Oakland Park Boulevard. Her husband, a Vietnam veteran, had called on me many times to help, and we did what we could, but she was beyond comfort. I want you to think about the unsung heroes. The unsung heroes is that spouse. They too took a vow of commitment to our nation. And their silence often is resounding. But we all have stories, wives, moms, dads, husbands have stories of those days when a loved one was in combat. And so I encourage you that if you have a story, write it down. I'm thinking about so many of our children and grandchildren may not know your story, but it's important. In 1981, I took time to write my story. I was traveling internationally and often was on national television. And so just for fun, I went ahead and wrote this is my story, to share how Jesus transformed me. And I was, well, that's another story. But then later on, when Mama passed away, I wrote, This Is Our Story. It sold out in 3 months. And we're going to have to do a rewrite of that. And then some time ago, a dear golfing buddy read my story. He said, Ed, I really liked your story, but all that religious stuff on the other chapters you could do away with. So we went ahead and we were having an evangelistic thrust, and we did what is called the Reader's Digest. This is our story. I have to tell you, thousands of these have gone out, and this one from 1981 actually went internationally. We heard from people in Russia, Hungary, Romania, England, Belgium, but enough of that. So we all have a story, and we need to write it down. We're not always going to be here, and our loved ones near to hear it. I remember my dear friend and elder, George Fagley, who was in the Second World War in the European campaign when it was time to do his funeral. And I did Ruthie's funeral as well, his wife, who was an amazing, amazing woman. And I always sit down with the family before a funeral. And so I said, well, George was a part of the Second World War, and he was in Europe in the European campaign. And we need to have veterans here, and we need to have a flag for him, and we need to honor him as a soldier. And one of his family members looked at me and said, "Oh, he didn't do anything. He was only a radio operator." Now, how many of you who were in combat know the value of a radio operator? All right, I lost it right there, and I tore into that person. And I gave them a clear definition of the value of a radio operator. And the other family members applauded me but I lost it. And that Latino temper sometimes comes up, and it did on that day. But we have a story that you need to share. When I was in middle school, we called it junior high school in those days, I fell in love with music, and I wanted to play the trumpet. But the band director, Jeff Schaefer, needed a French horn player. And even though he had a trumpet in the back room, he stuck me with a French horn, and I hated every minute of it. And then my aunt Nora, knowing how I wanted to play the trumpet, took me to Concord Music Store there in Allapattah, and bought me a Holton 3-colored cornet. And I played that all the way up to the time I was in service. 1967, I went off to college to Miami-Dade, and there I met Dr. Larry Zingale, the trumpet teacher, and I received my first trumpet lessons. Dr. Zingale was a World War II veteran and played in the Army band. And something happened between us that it was just God. And here's what I'd like for you to really think about. Your story and my story prove the providence and sovereignty of God. So when you write things out, you begin to see how He had such an integral part in your life. And Dr. Zingale, for whatever reason, took a liking to me, and often would spend time in his home. And even after I graduated and was in ministry, I would hear from him every month. He would call me. He says, "How's my boy doing?" When I would go visit him up in Virginia, first thing out of his mouth was, "Is a trumpet in the car?" I says, "Yes, Dr. Z." He says, "Go get it." And we'd go down to the basement for a lesson. But oftentimes he would take me when we would go play at the Fontainebleau, the Chic, the quarterback club, and I was second trumpet to him. I wasn't his best trumpet player in the band. But he knew one thing. He knew that I practiced harder than anyone else, and I did. I wasn't the best. I'm still not. I wish I could play trumpet like John Moore, but I just know that that's a standard that I cannot achieve. So in my second year of being in college, the lottery came up for service, and my number was 126, and it came up in February. Well, I didn't want to go into the Army. I knew that in the Army you had 6 weeks of basic training. They gave you a little leave, and then you went off to Vietnam, and you learned your military training in Vietnam, and that's not what I want. So I joined the Air Force. And while I was there, I was assigned to my permanent duty station in Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico. And my senior was a Master Chief by the name of Warren Riley. And one Sunday, he called me and he said, "Eddie, I want you to come to church." Well, I had just said, I don't want anything to do with church. All I want to do is music. I want to be a jazz musician. I practice and practice. I don't want to have anything to do with church. And I used to, while I was in college, I was minister of music and youth at Coral Church there near Coral Gables. And I did that just for the money. I didn't really have a commitment. Music, all I wanted to do was music. And then I went to church with the Rileys, with Helen and Chief Riley. And there the Spirit of the living God began to touch my heart and convict me. And the pastor heard that I did music when I was in college, and he said, "Would you help us with the choir?" And I said, "Oh, well, I'll do it, but you know, I have my service. I have to do my military service." And then word got out, and up in the mountains in a place called Ruidoso Downs, New Mexico, where they were having a revival. And the evangelist called me and said, "You know, our music evangelist got sick. He can't be here, but we hear you can lead music and sing. Would you come and help us?" And I didn't really want to do it, but you know, I thought about the money again. If you're in the service and you're not high ranked, a little bit of money helps. So I took the drive, which was an hour and a half up to Ruidoso Downs from Holloman Air Force Base, and every night I would lead music. Now, later they had what is called, and most of you probably know about this, but at the end of the revival, which was a week in those days, they had dinner on the grounds. And so I'm sitting there, and Audie Cathy, the minister, looked at me and said, "Ed, I have to be in Bisbee, Arizona next week, and I need someone to preach for me. Would you preach for me?" Before I knew what I said, "Sure." I had never given a sermon in my life. So when I got back to base, I called him and I said, "Audie, I can't do this. I've never given a sermon. I wouldn't even know how to start. And besides that, all I want to do is music." But what Audie didn't know is that a few weeks before, I had led a revival. I was doing music in a revival in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And silently and quietly, during an invitation, I felt this call to the ministry. And I just said, "You know, if this is really you, Lord, you're going to have to make it crystal clear, because the last thing I want to do is go into ministry. But if it's you, I'll do it." And then, of course, Audie asked me to preach. So he said, "Oh, Ed, you can give a nice sermon. Just come on up, stay in my home up here in the beautiful mountains, and the Lord will give you a message." And in those days, you gave 2 messages, Sunday morning and Sunday night. So in the first message on Sunday morning, I gave a message called, if the world fell in love with Jesus, what would happen? And then, just to be honorary, I thought, well, my Sunday night sermon I gave was on Hell's Angels. And I gave a sermon on hell. People don't believe in it anyhow, so I just said, what the hell is this? So what was amazing is that after I gave, when I was going up to the pulpit, and you have to understand, I was telling my wife Connie coming over here, I says, after 50 years, I still get nervous before I speak. And I was shaking, literally, physically shaking. So I'm praying as I'm walking up, and I says, "Lord God, if this is really you, and you really have a calling in my life, you're going to have to really make it clear and calm me down." And so I opened up the scriptures to 1 Corinthians 13, and as I'm reading, this supernatural calm came over my life. And I gave the message. At the end of the sermon, you always gave an invitation. 7 people walked forward to receive Jesus. And I thought, well, that's interesting, my first sermon. Sunday night, others came and gave their hearts to Christ. I said, this is ridiculous. So I'm making the drive back to the base, and I threw my hands up and I said, I give up. Well, later on, we get an emergency call to go to Southeast Asia. And while I'm in Southeast Asia, General Bellamy calls me into his office. And General says, Ed, I hear that you're going to seminary. And I was. There was a campus from Southwestern Theological Seminary there in Alamogordo. And I started going to night classes and taking classes. And I says, well, yes, sir, I am. He says, well, we don't have a chaplain. So I've already called Chief Riley in, and he's going to help you, and you're going to lead chapel services on Sunday until we finally get a chaplain on our base. I said, you got to be kidding me. I just can't run fast enough. And so I still have some of those type sermons there in my office. And Chief Riley and I would do Wednesday night gathering for Bible study. the chapel was full. Now, it's not because servicemen are so spiritual, but it was the only air-conditioned building in the entire base. The communists had destroyed everything, which is kind of a paradox. They destroyed every building on that base. We went in to rebuild, excepting they never touched the chapel. So anyways, there we go. And we would lead worship services on Sunday, and Sunday after Sunday, the chapel would be full until we finished our tour. And then I made my way home. By the time I got out of the military, I'd already had a couple of years of seminary behind me, and then I went off to seminary, and then graduate work, and then postgraduate work. And during that period of grad work and postgraduate, I couldn't play the trumpet. I didn't have time. You had to study. Well, let me get to something that's a brief part of my story. But the Lord's been with me, and I just have to tell you that He's with veterans, and even more important is that He's with the spouses of veterans, and He's a comfort to them. But it's not always comforting. You could talk to Kip's mom, and she's still, after all these years, not comforted. And so I want to take you in closing with a little bit of an illustration. And I want to take you back, and I want you to use your imagination, and I hope that it resonates with you. Picture yourself looking at a huge canopy, and under it, there are over 100 metal folding chairs. Every chair is occupied, and surrounding the canopy are people standing along the outside of that area. Every single person that is there to support one person. And she's sitting at the very center. She is a small, frail woman looking, she's dressed in black. And in her hand, she has a handkerchief, and she's tying it like a rope into a knot. And she's tying it as tight as she can. She's not looking up, but she is untying that knot, just something of a distraction. And then she may undo it, and then she ties it into a knot again, continuously, somehow trying to find a way to get through what is about to happen on that day. She's completely focused. Now, what's in front of her? If you could see through her eyes, you would see a casket about 30 feet in front of her. In front of that casket are 3 Marines. In the center is a sergeant, privates on each side, dressed in full uniform, dress uniform. The sergeant is wearing his combat medals, his Vietnam medal, his Purple Heart, which means that he was wounded in action. His white hat cover, he has white gloves, which are spotless. His buttons, leather belt, and shoes shine like the sun. The other 2 Marines take after their sergeant. The sergeant barks out an order. This frail woman watches as they march toward the casket, and she starts showing fear and hatred toward what is actually going on. She does not want to be there. 2 privates fold the flag and pass it on to the sergeant. The sergeant does an about face, heads toward the woman in the front row. And the sergeant stops in front of her, and with compassion in his voice, he bends down and says, "On behalf of the President of the United States." At this point, the woman quits listening. You see, this is not her first rodeo. She was a little girl when she sat with her mother in the same cemetery when they brought her father home. She was a grown woman sitting with her 6-year-old son when they brought her husband home. She immediately in her mind is screaming, "Enough! Enough! I can't take it anymore." At this point, she realizes that she can't run away from all of her supporters. However, as she looks at the flag in front of her, she is actually repulsed by it. She takes a deep breath and extends her hands to the sergeant, and he turns and places the flag in her hands. In one swift move, she presses the flag against her breast and has a flashback to the time when the nurse put her baby boy in her arms and she held him close to her chest. Immediately, the floodgates of her eyes burst open because it was confirmation. The minute she touched the flag, it became confirmation that the body of the person in the casket was her little boy, just 20 years old. She spoke for the first time since she got the news about her son, and only the people around her heard it. She said, "Enough, enough, enough. I can't take it anymore because I have nothing left to give." As part of the grieving process, she'll take this flag home. She hides it in the closet. Her belief is that out of sight, out of mind. One day, a couple of years later, she is cleaning out her closet when she hears a voice from the dark. Mom, Grandpa, Dad, and I are so sorry we hurt you. But you see, we took an oath that we had to follow through. Never forget that we love you." A year later, she is having a party, and a woman asks her what the flags are all about there on the mantle. She points at the first one and says, "This is my father's, and he was in the army." Then she said, "This is my husband's, and he was in the Navy." And then the third flag says, "This is my son's, and he is a Marine." When she finishes healing, she will be able to go from the present tense to the past tense. There's one thing that you need to take away today is to remember that as a veteran, the oath does not expire. And the true unsung heroes of veterans are their mates. You too are a veteran. Let us never, ever forget